All right, there. So now we're going to talk about photosynthesis. So hopefully you watched the information on respiration that I have in another video because you're going to need some of that to move forward into photosynthesis because they actually work together. And in fact, the role of photosynthesis is not necessarily to make energy. Plants actually still use respiration to make energy. The role of photosynthesis is to make the carbon substance that we need to break down for the energy. It's to make the sugar. All right, so let's see how this works. So this is the whole of the basic processes of photosynthesis. So in respiration, there were 4 individual processes. In photosynthesis, there's really only 2. We've got the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions. So this is where the energy from the light is actually picked up in some form. And then that energy is transferred over to the other side where light is not needed. It doesn't have to happen in the dark. These used to be called the dark reactions, but really they're much more could happen anytime. But that energy is then used to fix CO2, which is to take CO2 carbon dioxide and turn it into an organic molecule. So let's take the broad level view of what's happening here very quickly first. So as noted, the energy from this process starts as light. That energy is going to come into the chloroplast. So you can see this is indeed supposed to be a chloroplast. Chloroplasts, like mitochondria, have inner membranes, they have outer membranes, but in this case, they also have membrane-ish bound stacks called granum. They have even more membrane than mitochondria, if you thought that was possible, and you'll see why in a moment. And the goal of the light, in this case, the energy, is to capture it in some way. So as we've noted before, the main ways we capture energy are through redox reactions and phosphate transfer, preferably to a high energy molecule like ATP. So here is our ATP and our reduced, so there's our redox, NADPH molecule. These are the things that move over to this reaction. Therefore, the energy captured by the sun is what is needed to take the carbon dioxides and essentially jam them together to make the glucose. So this is an anabolic reaction. We have to make new bonds. That's a key part of it. The other thing, of course, we need to add to CO2 to make it organic is hydrogen. We need to reduce the CO2, and that reduction comes from these reduced compounds. Now, of course, if we had gotten this, we must have oxidized something. And in fact, one of the things we do to snag the electrons needed to make this process happen is break apart water, thereby oxidizing it to oxygen. All right, let's look at this process one step at a time, starting with the light reactions. All right, so the grana are these stacks of thylakoids, which are these small membrane-bound items, and they're inside the chloroplast. So right now we are inside the chloroplast. And the key thing that we're interested in is to follow, again, the energy. So here, these little lightning bolts are your light processes. That's where the photons of light, so don't forget, that is a moving particle. It's a very tiny particle, so tiny that it's hard to even gauge as a particle. But it's moving. The movement of the light comes down here and hits these proteins, which are photosystems. And they're not just proteins, they are proteins that contain light activated pieces. So they've got a number of different things in their structures, and we're not going to dive into the structures, but they're often made with some necessary bits of metals. So remember, we had cytochromes with heme groups to move things before, and we actually have another cytochrome in here. And a lot of times the photosynthesis stuff works on manganese and magnesium, which is another important metal. But what's really key here is that the photon, moving energy of the photon, jiggles essentially the atoms and molecules that are in the photosystem, causing enough energy to shake some electrons around. So now we have electron movement again, and we're going to shake those electrons just enough to use the energy of a redox to break apart an H2O molecule. So our water molecule breaks apart. It leaves us with oxygen. So the plant produces oxygen right here, right at the beginning, as soon as the light hits it, and of course some extra hydrogen ions when we break things apart. That releases electrons, and now, just like in respiration, we have a moving electron channel. So again, it's like a circuit. The electrons need to travel somewhere, and when they travel, they produce some energy. So we took the energy from the sun, we used it for a redox reaction, oxidation. We used that to push the electrons through the proteins, and the movement of the electrons through the proteins allows for active transport of hydrogen ions. So again, we are trying to build up hydrogen ions. We're actively transporting them against the gradient to the inside of the thylakoid, so it builds up on the inside. One of the neat quirks in photosynthesis is that there are two photosystem molecules. They're slightly different. And because of the order in which scientists discovered them and then discovered later that they worked in a particular way, photosystem 2 is actually the first molecule that the electron goes to. Then it goes through these other proteins, including the cytochrome. And then it goes to photosystem 1. So it works in that order. Here we get another boost from our photons, and then our electron is able to finally travel over to an NADP reductase. This one doesn't even mess around. It just tells you it's going to reduce NADP. And it does. And so the, again, gain of electrons, that's reduction, also picks up a hydrogen. We have NADPH. The nice thing is we have landed our electron, so that's our complete circuit. We need our NADP plus to grab it. And we have something energetic that we can use for later. But wait, weren't we supposed to produce ATP here? Well, interestingly enough, just like in the electron transport chain and respiration, we built up a bunch of hydrogens. We did that thing where we pushed all of the beach balls up in the attic again, only this time we pushed them to the inside of the thylakoid, the lumen of the thylakoid. And this build up of hydrogen ions actually can use exactly the same ATP synthase as is used in respiration, to produce a bunch of ATP. So light energy makes for redox energy, makes for electrical moving energy. The electrical energy allows active transport to build up the potential and positional energy of the hydrogen ions. And then when they fall down the gradient of ATP synthase, that energy is transferred to create ATP, where we can hold on to the energy, but not for too long, because we only have one more thing we need to do with it. And then, of course, some of that energy stored up here in our redox. So we took our light energy and we turned it into a little bit of redox energy and a lot of ATP energy. All right, what are we going to do with that energy? Well, the key thing we need to do with it is actually turn carbon dioxide into something useful. So organic carbon is useful for multiple reasons. One, it is something that can then also be broken down for more ATP, for more energy that is usable for the plant, but also because some of it is needed to actually build the plant's structure. So a huge portion of the glucose produced does actually go to physically building the plant. So it produces the glucose in the leaves. And as you might learn in other videos about plants, a lot of it gets stored down in the stem and in the roots. And then that, of course, is how we get the glucose to eat. Or in some cases, another animal, like a cow, gets the glucose to eat, and then they turn it into the proteins and fats in their muscle tissue. So it's really interesting the way this all works. All right, this is the Calvin cycle. It should, interestingly enough, remind you a little bit of the citric acid cycle, but it is honestly a little bit simpler, but also a little bit stranger. So let's take a look at how it works. So it starts with the important idea that we have CO2. And it starts, you'll notice, with 3 molecules of CO2. So this does some very large-scale reactions. The first large-scale reaction that it does is it adds those 3 molecules of CO2 to molecules of this stuff, RUBP. So this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbon molecule. We've got 3 of them. We're going to take one CO2 and add it to each of them. So then it becomes a 6-carbon molecule. And what it immediately does, you'll notice this has 2 phosphate groups on it. If you'll remember, phosphates are kind of doing that tug of war thing. So they make a very unstable molecule, and tacking on just that one more CO2 and throwing an enzyme in the mix causes these molecules to break in half. Snap. So for each of the 5 carbons, we add 1 CO2 and we break it into 2 3-carbon molecules. Since we started with 3 of everything, now we have 6 3-carbon molecules. Don't get too caught up in the numbers because it's not that important. But what is that 3 carbons came in. All right. This was not too difficult to process because we had previously set up these phosphate groups. And so one nice enzyme, Rubisco, which is a shortened version of the enzyme, can then easily make these 6 molecules with just the one phosphate group on them. But we need more energy to really make this work. We need to take this molecule and turn it into something usable, specifically do a little more reduction on it. Right now, we've just added CO2 to it. We still need more hydrogen to be added for this to work. So through a process that uses energy, so a piece of energy is used for each molecule, and snags one of our reduced substances, so that's even more energy, it's able to turn this 3-carbon molecule into this one, which, if you'll notice, the biggest difference here is that we took away an oxygen and added a hydrogen. Honestly, it seems real small, but it takes a fairly large amount of energy to make that happen because it takes one of each of these. But what's neat about this molecule is that it is Ga3P, which if you actually go back to glycolysis, you'll find at the end of the stage 1 or energy using section of glycolysis, and any reaction that can go forward can go backward. So this molecule can reconnect and turn into glucose. So right now, though, there's only 3 carbons in it, and we're only going to take one of them to get the 3 carbons we grabbed. So we have to run this circle twice to make a glucose, but it's not too hard. All right, so we've gotten our reduced organic carbon molecule out of the Calvin cycle. Now all the Calvin cycle needs to do is regenerate the original molecule. That also takes a little bit of energy. So you can see over here, there are 3 more ATP that are used to essentially take these molecules. So now there are, this is where it gets a little bit funky, 5 3-carbon molecules. And it does a little fancy rearranging, we're not getting into the details, to end up with 3 5-carbon molecules, all of which have phosphates on them so that they are ready to grab those CO2s, break apart, and keep going. All right, so the basics of the Calvin cycle are that 3 CO2s enter. Energy is used to reduce the molecules they attach to. One of those molecules is essentially half a glucose and it leaves the cycle. Then it regenerates and does that again. Once we have 2 halves of a glucose, we can make a glucose, or we can actually send this molecule just to glycolysis. It depends on what we need to do. If we need to build and store sugar, it will build it into glucose or cellulose or starch. Where do you think the starch in those roots comes from? And send it on down the line. If it needs to turn it into energy, it may send the molecule directly to the mitochondria for respiration. So this is the process that uses up the energy. The energy was created in photosynthesis. We're now using our ATPs and our NADPH to make our carbon compound. So the key thing to photosynthesis is that photosynthesis isn't really making energy. It's making organic carbon, which can then be used both to build plants and to make more energy. It feels weird, but it works. The other neat thing is that photosynthesis produces its own oxygen for the process of respiration. So it doesn't need to go grabbing extra oxygen. It's already got it. And actually, it produces more than it needs, which is how the plants produce oxygen that we can then use as well. All right. So that's really the basics of photosynthesis. So go back to our combination factor so you can see it all together. The light comes in through a series of reactions that involve a lot of redox. We are able to oxidize water to oxygen, create energy in the form of ATP and NADPH, use the energy to take carbon in the form of CO2 and turn it into organic carbon that could become energy or could become glucose. It sends back these sort of leftover pieces so it can use them again. And we have a nice circling cycle that, with just the energy from the sun and CO2 and H2O, which are in abundance on this planet, or at least more of an abundance than we need, CO2 is especially in more of an abundance than we currently need, it produces extra oxygen and carbon, which is good for everybody. So I hope that helps you understand how photosynthesis approximately works, where the energetics fall, and how it fits into a plant actually being able to function. Great.